What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in for this World Cup preview edition of the show. As always, before I get going, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. You can find all of my group previews there. I've already done separate videos previewing each group, looking at the biggest storylines, the names to know, all of those good things, so you can check those out as well. Before I get going with today, because this is exclusively a World Cup preview show, I want to take a second to acknowledge the incident that has happened. Reportedly, two people plus the assailant have lost their lives. There does not seem to be thankfully, any impact on the tournament itself. The teams, everybody seems to be safe and accounted for. But obviously, this is happening, miles away, hours before this tournament is supposed to start. And so, obviously, heartbroken for the people involved, the friends and family of those who lost their lives. Hopefully, this is a very one-off thing that does not become part of the story of this tournament. It's obviously very jarring for it to happen in places like Australia and New Zealand, where thankfully gun violence is not common like it is here in the United States. And so I did want to take a second to acknowledge that event has happened. There's plenty of coverage of it. You can go read more about exactly what happened and how different federations have handled it and what they're saying and all of that. But as of what I found at the moment of this recording, no impact on the tournament itself. So once again, just thoughts and prayers with the victims' friends and families, and hopefully that is the end of that story as it relates to the World Cup. The first thing I'm going to do here in segment one is the same thing I did in December for the Men's World Cup. Going to kind of format this show the exact same way, starting with World Cup tiers, breaking down all 32 teams into 4 different groups using the same categories I had last time: underdogs, dark horses, contenders, favorites. So my basic breakdown here: underdogs are the teams you're not expecting very much from, not expecting to be a major factor in the way that the tournament plays out. Your dark horses, I'm defining, generally speaking, as teams that have a chance to get out of a group that could potentially cause some issues for a team that's expected to get out of the group and steal their spot, send them home early, something like that. In a perfect scenario, maybe they can make a run, win a game or two in the knockout stage. I don't see them getting past the quarterfinals, though. And I will acknowledge I did have Morocco in this category for the Men's World Cup, and we all know what happened there. So just throwing that in as part of the equation as well. So these are it kind of breaks down as, team 4, the top team in the group, second best, third best, and fourth best, but it's not that simplistic, and you'll see as I go along with that. The contenders, the differentiator for me between dark horses and contenders is kind of 2 things. One, can I actually see this team winning the tournament? And 2, does this team have a real legitimate shot at making to the semifinals, making the final, where if they end up as one of the 4 teams left standing at the end, you're not that surprised by it. And then, of course, your favorites are the favorites. So here we go. Starting with the underdogs, I have 7 of them: Philippines, Costa Rica, Haiti, Vietnam, Panama, South Africa, and Morocco. 5 of these 7 countries are making their Women's World Cup debut. The 2 who have participated before, Costa Rica and South Africa, have played in 1 Women's World Cup. And this is the one that was pretty straightforward in terms of relating to the groups. 7 teams here. Obviously, you have 8 groups. It's one team from every group except for Group B. And I'll touch on that a little bit more when I get to the dark horses. But generally, these are your 7 teams expected to finish at the bottom of their groups. And these are the teams that I have a hard time seeing find a way to even get to third, where there's just clearly a gap between that third team and the fourth team. Like I said, right, most of these, these are kind of also generally speaking, some of the teams that benefited from the fact that the tournament expanded. And so you're seeing a lot of debuts, a lot of really inexperienced teams that are still kind of building their women's programs, those kind of things. So those are my 7 teams there. Don't have too much else to say about that. There they are. Dark horses. I have 11. And I'm going, this list, I should have said this earlier, the list is in order of the groups, and then alphabetically within the groups. So, dark horses, New Zealand, Switzerland, Ireland, Nigeria, Zambia, China, Portugal, Jamaica, Argentina, Colombia, Korea, South Korea. Like I said at the beginning, these are teams that have a chance to get out of the group stage that I could see advancing to the knockout stage. New Zealand have some reservations, but I can't put you in the underdog category when you're playing at home and you have World Cup experience. And you've been at least remotely competitive. There's a world in which they could have a decent tournament. Couldn't put them any higher than dark horses, certainly, because I don't expect them to get out of their group. But it wouldn't be the strangest thing in the world. And then, you kind of look down this list. Switzerland, Ireland, obviously, established European teams or strong soccer culture in the case of Ireland. I'll get to them a little bit more in a minute. And then it's some of your, again, a lot of these third teams in the groups that I'm not necessarily picking to get out of the group, but I wouldn't be shocked, and I kind of laid out this out in my group previews, if some of these teams end up being one of the 16 left in the knockout stage. The other part of this is I don't see these teams making deep runs. Maybe quarterfinals in a best case scenario. But especially with the way that the disparities that are still in the women's game, I don't see any of these teams in the semifinals. A couple teams I'm most interested in, kind of the intrigue here. I mentioned Group A. New Zealand, Switzerland. Switzerland is the team that is supposed to be that second team. They are one of the weaker second teams, which is why I put them into this category with New Zealand, and I would not be stunned if New Zealand found a way to top Switzerland and get out of that group. Same kind of situation in Group H with Colombia and South Korea. This is South Korea's second spot to lose. However, Colombia is really progressing nicely. You're seeing all kinds of very positive upward trajectory type things with that country and where this program is. The gap is not that large between these two. So I feel differently about some of these quote-unquote second teams that I put in here, specifically Group A and Group H, than I do about the rest of the teams that are expected to get out of groups that I put into the contenders category. The other two things I want to highlight quickly here. Group B. As I mentioned, this is the one group I did not have any underdogs, because Ireland just has too much talent, especially now that it sounds like Denise O'Sullivan is going to be okay. Great news on that front after that very scary, bizarre situation in the warm-up game. And Nigeria. These are teams in another group that would have a real chance of advancing. They just happen to also be drawn with Australia and Canada, and these tiers don't correlate to groups necessarily. I'm not trying to break it group by group. I'm trying to separate all of the teams and look at them in a vacuum. And so absolutely, Ireland, Nigeria, from a talent perspective on paper, much more dark horses than underdogs. So Group B, to me, is the deepest, toughest group because there is no easy game there. And then you also have Argentina in here. It's a group that includes Italy and Sweden. So again, you're not necessarily expecting Argentina to get out of it. But of these teams, I might be the most confident in Argentina. It's probably Argentina or China. I almost kind of considered bumping them up into the contenders, but ultimately I just didn't have enough faith in them. So those are some of the teams in this dark horse category that I'm interested in, that I think could make some noise in this tournament. So if you're looking for somebody, I'm also really excited to see what Jamaica can do. Don't think it's going to result in getting out of a group. But some of these teams, when you're talking Jamaica, Zambia with their attacking talent, Argentina, Colombia, Korea, China, there are some really good teams in here that are top 15, 20 teams in the world. There's just this line that I couldn't put them above with the contenders. But that's what the dark horses are for. Is if you tell me South Korea ends up in the quarterfinals, especially with their group and the way things could line up for them, I would not be surprised at all. I'm not picking it to happen, but there are plenty of same thing with Switzerland, Argentina, China. You could tell me just about anything in Group B and I wouldn't be floored. It's becoming much more interesting from this perspective on the women's side, which is really exciting, that these aren't even your tier 2 teams. These are your tier 3 teams. And I'm excited to watch them. They have really good players. They're going to be a factor in this tournament, which is awesome to see. That's what you want, is the elevated level of competition. You're seeing it at the top of the sport, and you're also seeing the depth improve and the number of quality teams improve. And we're going to see that in this tournament. Then we go to the contenders. There are 10 of them. Norway, Australia, Canada, Spain, Japan, Denmark, Netherlands, Brazil, France, Italy. As I said at the beginning, these are teams I could see getting to the semifinals. These are teams that you could talk me into a world in which they win the whole thing. Wouldn't pick it, but these are kind of your secondary favorites, if you will. Would not be surprised at all if they end up in the semis, if they end up pulling off an upset against one of the favorites. I do firmly believe that there's a gap between these teams in the top 4, though. And I'll explain more about that when I get to the favorites. The closest 3 that I thought about moving into the favorites category: Spain, Brazil, France. Norway, I love this team. I really love this team. I can't sit here and call you a favorite. Talent-wise, they're not quite there. And also, they haven't delivered in major tournaments. I can't call you a favorite if you haven't done this before. Australia. Really like this team as well. I'm a big believer in the home field advantage when it comes to World Cups. Just not quite enough to go into the favorites category. Canada, I have concerns. Janine Becky's injury, the trying to get all of these players kind of back that have been injured over the past year or so. How do you follow up what they did at the Olympics? I see this being a disappointing tournament for Canada, so I'm certainly not putting them in the favorites. Japan, just the ceiling to me is the semis in a perfect world. And I think it's more realistically the quarterfinals. They just don't have the top end talent needed to get into the favorites category. Denmark, kind of the same thing. Don't have enough star power. Netherlands, Vivian Miedema is not there. That pretty much disqualifies you from being a favorite in my mind. And Italy is kind of the last team that squeaked into this group. I do believe in the overall talent here, even though they had a really disappointing Euros. But they are the bottom of this group for me, so they certainly are not going to be in the favorites. Then we've got the 3 teams I mentioned that I considered moving up. We'll start with Spain. Would I be stunned if Spain won this tournament? No. I have my reservations, though. One, Alexia Putellas is working her way back still. She is not firing on all cylinders, not at 100% game shape, doesn't have a bunch of 90-minute performances under her belt. That's a concern. More concerning, though, is the players who aren't there. And the fact that there's still this tension with the Federation. You got a bunch of inexperienced players who are now being asked to play much bigger roles that weren't supposed to. And on top of all of that, I do have a mental hurdle with the Spain/Barcelona core until I see them deliver against the best in the world. And I mean that in a very literal sense. This is one of the fascinating parts about the conversation regarding Barcelona's Champions Leagues for me. And of course, it's not the exact same thing, but there are plenty of players from that Barcelona team that are also on this Spanish national team. They haven't beat Lyon in a final. They've won in the years where Lyon hasn't reached the final. This Spanish team has all kinds of talent. Didn't reach and I know Alexia Putellas was injured, didn't reach weren't major factors at Euro 2022, didn't reach the final. I need to see them actually take that step. It's the same way I feel about Norway. The roster is terrific. The talent is there to win it. I'm just not putting you in the favorites category if I haven't seen you do it before. And if you are not clearly the most talented team at this competition. If they were at full strength and had everybody that they wanted, maybe they have to be in the favorites conversation. But that's not the reality of the situation. There are players who are missing. And so I'm not putting them in the favorites. Brazil, really like this team. Really excited to watch this team. I think this team is being slept on a little bit. Again, though, just top-end talent. Not quite enough to put them into the favorites. And France, I have concerns about the attack with the injuries. They just don't have the most depth in the world. They're also not maybe they're a top 5 team at full strength. They're probably more like 6 or 7. And so you take that down a level with the injuries to really important attacking players, and I can't put them in the favorites either. I feel very strongly that there is a clear line between this group and the 4 teams I'm going to talk about next. Doesn't necessarily mean that all 4 of these are, picking these 4 teams to make the semifinals, and I'll get to that in the next segment, and it probably won't work out that way anyway. But there are 4 teams that are justifiable to pick to win this competition. Anybody else, I think you're asking for a stroke of good fortune and for something unexpected to happen, which of course is possible. It's a World Cup. Who knows? But I just can't talk myself into a scenario. Really, the only team I can talk myself into is Spain. That Alexia Putellas all of a sudden looks like herself again, is the best player in this tournament, hands down. That's a world in which I could see Spain winning. That's pretty much the only team in this group that I feel that way about, that I can envision a scenario in which they win. Which gets to the favorites, the 4 teams I can envision winning this competition. Now, there is a little bit of a delineation here. Sweden is definitely team 4 in this for me. But when you're making the semifinals of every major tournament you play in, which is what Sweden have basically done in this World Cup cycle, you're getting into the favorites category. To me, they're also one of the 4 most talented teams in the world. I don't know what other justification there needs to be here. I feel much more confident in Sweden than I do in Spain or anybody else, which is why Sweden's in this category and everybody else were contenders. And then you've got the other 3. I said this in my group preview, I'll say it again. To me, at full strength, you give me one team, I want England. Of course, England is not at full strength, but you still have plenty to work with here, and you have players who made significant contributions to that Euro win coming off the bench that are now prepared to play bigger roles. Looking at you, Alicia Russo, Chloe Kelly, Rachel Daly can now play striker. There are some holes that need to be filled, but they have the ability to fill those holes. So, of course, they're going to be one of the favorites. Then you got the U.S., betting favorite, probably the most talented team on paper in this tournament. The U.S. is a favorite at any World Cup it goes to. That's number one. And number two, in a World Cup where you have so many players missing, the U.S. was able to call, Alyssa Thompson and Lynn Williams off the bench, didn't need Ashley Hatch. You can go down the list of the players who didn't make this team. Nobody has the depth of the United States. So they're obviously in the favorites too. And then there's Germany. There are at most two teams with a better chance of winning than Germany. That's England and the U.S. I've been a little bit surprised at how much momentum is behind Germany. I'm going to talk about whether I agree with that or not when I get to my predictions in the next segment. But the one thing I will say again here is if that Euro 2022 final is at a neutral venue, Germany probably wins. And if we're going to talk about England the way we've been talking about England over the last year, and justifiably so, we got to be talking the same way about Germany. And so those three teams immediately went in. I also went with Sweden just because I think there is a clear gap between Sweden and everybody else. So those are my four favorites. Those are your World Cup tiers. I'm going to take my first break. When I come back, storylines and predictions. What are kind of the big picture things to be looking at in this tournament? And, of course, who is ultimately going to take home the trophy? You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week on YouTube. This segment, all about storylines and predictions. If you haven't seen the World Cup tiers video, be sure to check that out that I did in the first segment. I'm going to start this one with storylines. I have three big picture things I'm looking at for this tournament in terms of kind of the talking points and what I think ultimately might kind of decide it, or what we're going to end up looking back on this tournament and kind of associating with it. The first one, unfortunately, is very simply the missing players. I've talked about this in group previews, brought it up on multiple occasions. The two best teams in the world talent-wise, or at least two of the best three if you want to throw Germany in there. But I do feel like the U.S. and England have a slight edge over Germany at full strength. U.S. No Catalina Macario. No Sam Mewis. And those two players, it's been at least... Macario was hoping to come back. Sam Mewis is obviously dealing with a very long-term injury that kept her out. But those are just the secondary ones that it's easy to forget about, the players that probably would have been on this roster that aren't. And then you talk about Mallory Swanson, who's arguably been this team's best player over the past year and a half or so, and your captain and Becky Sauerbrunn. That's a huge deal for any team. And then you go to England. Similar situation. Best attacking player, Beth Mead. Captain, kind of emotional leader, heart of your back line, Leah Williamson. Both gone. And so the best two teams on paper at full strength have a lot of juggling and figuring out how to compensate for missing key pieces. In a tournament that is already going to be easily the most competitive Women's World Cup of all time. Now you've added another element to make it more difficult for the favorites to actually deliver. And then you get to the tier 2 teams. France, I mentioned those injuries, that really scares me. Spain, not necessarily injuries, but the tensions between the players and the federation, it's not a full strength team. And you have kind of the emotional and mental ramifications that come with that. And then Vivian Miedema for the Netherlands. To me, that probably takes him out of the running to win this tournament. That one injury. And so these are not just big time players that are missing, that are recognizable names. These are players on teams hoping to win this tournament. These are injuries that could tip the balance one way or the other. It makes it the story heading into this tournament is who can compensate best for this? Does it open the door for somebody else to go and win this tournament? And does depth end up making the difference? Because the U.S. is better equipped to deal with injuries than any other team in the world? Or does the fact that Germany, who generally have escaped these injuries, can throw 16 players out there that are probably better than any other combination of 16 because the U.S. doesn't have Trinity Rodman as your striker coming off the bench because Trinity Rodman is starting because Mallory Swanson's not there. And if a center back is not available, might have to move Julie Ertz, and all of a sudden you're trying to replace Julie Ertz, which has been an issue for the past 3 years. Right? One weird thing with this U.S. team, and I am concerned, quite frankly. Same thing with England. Can you replace one more player after the ones you've already had to replace? And so if Germany goes on to win this thing, that's going to be part of the story is they had something much closer to their full strength team. And when the margins are so slim between these teams anyway, that might be the deciding factor, is that you can bring on a dynamic playmaker in the 75th minute that gives you a little bit more than what the England or the United States can, because the player that they were supposed to be bringing on, Chloe Kelly or Trinity Rodman, is now thrust into a bigger role because Beth Mead and Mallory Swanson aren't there. The second thing is the emerging teams. And I talked about this a little bit with the tiers. I'm really excited to just continue to see how competitive the teams that you don't associate with being the powerhouses in women's soccer can be in this tournament. And there are a few in particular I want to highlight, starting with Ireland. World Cups are just better when Ireland are at them. And this is a team that has real talent and a great duo to kind of carry the goal scoring load, carry the creative force, be the creative force for this team, carry the attacking burden, even though it's not necessarily what Denise O'Sullivan does. Her and Katie McCabe, that's a great starting point for this team. Those are the kind of players that can go win you a game in the knockout stage if you're able to get there, or can go win you a game to get you to the knockout stage. Zambia, with that attacking talent that they have, excited to see what they can do as they're kind of continuing, you make an Olympics, continuing to develop there. Argentina fell off the map a little bit, starting to really get back on track. Exciting players, very talented players. What can they do in this tournament? And then the other one is Colombia. South America is really starting to grow. Those two teams in particular. Obviously, Brazil has always kind of been the standard. And there are plenty of other teams that you could talk about in this group. But those are the ones that really stood out to me of teams that, not necessarily a South Korea or a China or a Japan or somebody who's been around and has had success that maybe is not in the top tier necessarily. But these teams that are coming on the rise that you may not be thinking about heading into this tournament are some of the ones I'm really excited to watch. and specifically getting Ireland in that group where not expected to get out of it because you got two of the best 10 or so teams in the world in there, but where they can make the difference between and kind of maybe even determine who gets out of that group because they can beat any of those teams on any given day. So those four teams, Ireland, Zambia, Argentina, Colombia, are ones that I am really looking forward to, not only in this tournament, but kind of how this tournament builds the foundation for them moving forward. Finally, the federation issues. Just off the top of my head, basically, here are some of the ones that I have been reading about, thinking about, hearing, that are out there that you can go do more research on. Ireland has a coach who's been implicated in the mistreatment of players in the NWSL. That's kind of separate from the rest of this, but I'm throwing it out there as another controversy, question mark, off-field issue that is involved in this tournament. You have the federation issues: Spain, France, Canada, England. Spain, obviously, there are players who aren't there. How does it work bringing these players like Alexia Putellas back into the fold after all of the tension and the just everything that has gone on? I mean, players just resign from the national team. Some of them are playing in this tournament. It's not like everything has changed, but they're back. France, you had the same kind of situation where your captain Wendy Bernard said, "I'm not playing in the World Cup." Coaching change, she's back. How does that all work? Canada, all kinds of frustrations on both the men's and women's sides with this federation. Couldn't get him a send-off game. There's been talk of bankruptcy. It's just a disaster. How does that part of this work? And then England, I'm throwing them in really quickly because they couldn't get to an agreement on bonuses with the FA reportedly. That one is less concerning for me than these other ones, but even your reigning European champions, federation issues heading into this tournament. And then you have the stories, and these are just the ones that I have seen and read about. I would not be surprised at all if they are far from the only ones. But Jamaica, all kinds of frustrations with their federation. That's also been going on the men's side for a long time. And Nigeria with some of the stuff that's gone on there. It's just really difficult to perform at your best in the most important tournament of your career when you don't feel like your federation is supporting you, when you don't have the resources that you want, that you feel like you need. It just creates a lot of distractions and frustration that keep you from being 100% locked into what you're there to do. And so this is going to be a story because players have not been shy about sharing their frustrations. And whether it's just the impact it has on the tournament or whether we hear more during this tournament and more things come to light, players are speaking out, whatever it might be, this is going to be part of the Women's World Cup and women's soccer in general until these issues don't exist anymore. And the U.S. has really set the bar and kind of continued to push. And you're seeing other federations follow suit. And so as that is happening, there are going to be these issues, these tensions, these off-field dramas with federations, and this tournament is not immune to that. I'm going to take another break and come back with World Cup predictions. So hang on for just 1 second. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. It is prediction time. So, I'm going to start in the round of 16, and I'm going to talk through what I think is going to happen in this tournament. Gonna put it on there, put it out there on the record, and then I'm sure look at least somewhat silly by the end. I'm not going to try and walk through all of the different permutations and the ways that this sets up, because it is not as simple as just Group A plays Group B. And so one thing changes and it just becomes a whole mess, and it's difficult to find out who's going to play who. So I'm just walking through my 16 and what I think this is going to look like. So your first sort of quarter of the bracket is going to set up your winner of Group A against your second place team in Group C. For me, that is Norway, Japan. I don't think that's too surprising. Not calling any upset there. Those are just the two teams that are expected to get through. That then sets up with the winner of Group E and the second place team from Group G. Group E, I have the United States winning, and that leads to a matchup with Italy as the second team out of Group G. I am not all that confident in Italy getting out of that group, but I still have enough faith that they're going to figure things out this time around and be better than they were at the Euros. And if they get anything close to their full potential, they're going to get out of that group. So I'm going to continue to have at least some faith in Italy to get to the round of 16. So that sets up Norway, Japan, USA, Italy for spots in the quarterfinals. Norway, Japan, I'm going Norway. I believe in this team. I don't want to give up on this team. It is the better team on paper. At some point, this just has to happen for Norway. They should be able to get past Japan. And then I'm taking the United States. Just too much talent for Italy. Italy is just not used to being able to play against those kind of teams. Of course, they see them in UEFA, but they haven't really been competitive with them. There's just a clear gap there. So, Norway, United States, two teams in the quarterfinals. On the other side of that bracket, you have the winner of Group C and the second place team from Group A. That is Spain and Switzerland for me. Again, Switzerland's one of those teams that I don't feel great about, but ultimately I'm just sticking with the teams that I feel like are the best on paper. And so Switzerland find a way to get through. Spain, they're still the best team in that group, even though I've expressed my reservations about them. That game then faces the winner of the top of Group G and the second place team from Group E. That is Sweden and the Netherlands. Difficult draw for Sweden, who should win their group without any issue. Assuming nothing bizarre happens, you get the Netherlands or the United States in the round of 16 as those two teams in Group E. I expect the U.S. to win the group, so that gives you the Netherlands. And you couldn't avoid them by finishing second because you're going to have to play one of them anyway. So Sweden, just unfortunate draw, and an unfortunate draw for the Netherlands too, or the United States. If you don't win that group, there's just a clear team you're trying to avoid out of Group G, and that is Sweden, and one of them is not going to be able to. So, Spain, Switzerland, I'm going Spain. Just too much talent. Switzerland is not on their level. Sweden, Netherlands, I'm going Sweden. I believe in this Sweden team. They generally do what they're supposed to at tournaments. They don't get upset. If it was a different matchup, I would absolutely be able to talk myself into the Dutch making the quarterfinals. But without Vivian Miedema, Sweden just has too much. So, one side of your quarterfinals, Norway, United States, Spain, Sweden. Going to the other side of the bracket. You got the winner of Group B and the second place team from Group D. I'm going Australia to top this brutal Group B. I am concerned for Canada. I don't think there's too much between those teams anyway. And Australia is at home. I'm a big believer in that. if I'm Australia and I'm looking at that group, there is nobody that scares me. It's a very difficult group. There are no guaranteed points. But that is absolutely a group Australia can win. And then you get to second place in Group D. It should be Denmark. I don't expect England to have any problems in that group, so that leaves Denmark as your second team facing Australia in the round of 16. The winner of that game plays the winner of the first place team in Group F and second place team in Group H. I'm going to Brazil to top Group F. I have some worries about France missing a couple attacking players, the tensions with the Federation recently, and quite frankly, this Brazil team might just be better. I really, really like the foundational pieces of this Brazil team. Of course, Marta's still there. You got Dabinha. I'm a huge Caroline fan. This might be a little bit of one of my hotter takes, but there's just not much between these teams on paper for me anyway. And the one that has better vibes, better feel, more confidence right now is Brazil. So I'm going for them to top Group F. That sets up a meeting with South Korea as the second team from Group H. This is another one. This group behind Germany is wide open. Ultimately, I do think it's South Korea who goes through, so that puts them as the second team because I expect Germany to do what they're supposed to. So, Australia, Denmark, give me Australia at home, more talent, have the best player on the field, checks all the boxes there. Brazil, Korea, give me Brazil, better team. I really like where they're going, as I mentioned before. So, they will advance, and then the second half of that bracket, first place team in Group D, that is England. Don't really need to elaborate on that. Facing the second place team from Group B. So this is also a really interesting one in terms of how does this play out in Group B. Because you're not only playing to top your group if you're Canada and Australia, you're also playing to avoid England. In this instance, Canada is the team that does not get to avoid England. I have England winning that one. And then Germany, as your first place team in Group H, plays France as your second place team in Group F. I have Germany, better team, more confident. I feel very good about where Germany is at. So, your quarterfinals: Norway, United States, Spain, Sweden, Australia, Brazil, England, Germany. Going back to the other side, Norway, United States, I'm going with the U.S. I can't talk myself into a Norway team that hasn't gotten to the the very hold on one second. The very, very end of these tournaments, semifinals, in beating the United States. Could it happen? Absolutely. I might even be more confident in it happening than most people. But I can't predict it's going to happen when I haven't seen it from Norway. So the U.S. is into the semifinals. Spain and Sweden. I'm taking Sweden. This is where you're comparable, if not better, on paper. All of the kind of extraneous stuff that Spain is still dealing with, the players that aren't there, to me it's a little bit too much. I just have a hard time seeing them get to the semis, unless everything breaks perfectly for them. So, give me Sweden, then Australia, Brazil. I'm going to go Australia. Maybe Brazil has a little bit more talent, but Australia has Sam Kerr. Australia is at home. I don't see anything in the way that this bracket is going to lay out that stops Australia from getting to the semifinals. We've seen them do it before, and now they're playing in front of their fans. And there isn't an England, a Germany, a Sweden, a United States to get in their way yet. And my thought process is basically, if those four teams aren't there, I'm going to stick with Australia. And I'm going to bet on Sam Kerr. I'm going to bet on the Matildas being at home. And then the quarterfinal, if this all plays out the way that I have it here, England, Germany, rematch of Euro 2022 final. I'm going Germany. Germany will feel like they should have won that game. They probably would have if it was at a truly neutral venue as opposed to being played at Wembley. I also just think Germany might be a little bit better at this moment with the squad they were able to bring because of those injuries to England. And there's the other part of this, which is I am also a huge believer in the extra motivation you can find coming off of a massive disappointment, as opposed to the motivation to go repeat or build on what you did. England had the moment of their lifetimes last summer, and now you got to go do it again. Germany came so close to having one of those moments. To me, it just gives you a little bit more of an edge. So if everything else is equal, that's going to tip me in the favor of Germany. So semifinals: USA, Sweden on one side, Australia, Germany on the other. USA, Sweden, I'm going with the United States. Don't feel great about it, to be honest. Ultimately, I trust this US team, and coming off of an Olympics where things did not go well, I expect this team to show up and do what they need to do. Whether that means they actually win the tournament is a different discussion. That's what's changed at this World Cup. The conversation surrounding this U.S. women's national team has to change if they don't win because they lose in the semifinals or something. They might have just lost to a team that was right on their level and it was a 50-50 game. That's not something you say in previous World Cups. They have been the standard and the clear favorites. They are the favorites probably, but not by very much at all. So anything outside the semifinals, massive disappointment. But once you get to the semis, I really feel like this is the first tournament where, hey, anything can happen. You don't need to read too much into it. But I do think they get past Sweden. Sweden has really struggled in these semifinals. You could flip that and say, well, ultimately they're going to... The logic just says if they keep playing them, they're going to win one of them. But I have enough faith in this U.S. team coming off of a disappointing Olympics to get to the final. Australia, Germany, this is where Australia's run comes to an end. Germany is just simply the better team, has the extra added edge coming off of the disappointment at Euro 2022. They just played at Wembley too in that final. They won't be fazed by facing Australia at home. They know what those kind of environments are like. You know, some of these players just played in the Champions League final with Wolfsburg. I'm not concerned about the Germans handling Australia at home. They know what they're doing in high pressure, really, packed environments. They're going to be fine. So that sets up a USA-Germany final. I went back and forth. I don't feel great about it. But ultimately, I went with Germany. And I've been surprised at how much I have seen this. I thought this might be kind of my contrarian hot take thing that I firmly believe in. It's not a hot take for hot take's sake. But I thought I had more confidence in Germany than some other people, and it doesn't seem like that's as much the case as I thought. To me, there is a real argument that player for player, they are the most talented team at this tournament. I'm not sure I buy that, but I will entertain it as a conversation. Then you throw in the fact that I do believe that their strength is the 5 players who are going to come off the bench, which is more of a question mark, as I've talked about, for the U.S. and for England, because those players are now starting because of the absentees. And I really, really, really believe in the challenge of continuing to repeat it, continuing to elevate your standard, as opposed to having and being continuing to fend off everybody chasing you, as opposed to Germany getting to the semis, getting to the final, and being so determined to not let what happened at Euro 2022 happen again and use that heartbreak to fuel them. It's not that the other teams don't care. I just fundamentally believe there is another level of motivation and intensity and energy you can find when you have something like that to point to, when you have this driving force. It's why Michael Jordan would, come up with all of these random ways to make himself feel like he was slighted. That's how you get the mental edge. Germany is going to have that because of how close they came last summer. And they might just be the most talented team at this tournament, too. And so, ultimately, that's where I came down on this. So, again, your semifinals, USA over Sweden, Germany over Australia. Give me Germany to win the 2023 Women's World Cup. That is all for the predictions segment. I'm going to take one more break and come back with a quick weekend look ahead, highlighting some of the early group stage games in the World Cup as well as Leagues Cup, the games you should be paying attention to in the world of soccer this weekend. You're watching the Touchline Talk Show. Don't go anywhere. And welcome back one final time to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is time for the weekend look ahead. Only 2 events I'm going to cover here. You also have NWSL games in the Challenge Cup. Be sure to check that schedule. See if you want to tune into any of those. I'm going to stay just focused on the World Cup and Leagues Cup, though, as it's kind of hard to figure out what even to say about Challenge Cup games that have been going on through the season. You got so many players missing. So NWSL still in action for the Challenge Cup. World Cup games to look for, though, this weekend. I highlighted 3. First, United States, Vietnam on Friday night. First test for this U.S. women's national team. See what they look like. See what kind of starting lineup Vlatko rules out there. Against a Vietnam team that has looked impressive at times, that the U.S. should handle without any issue. But all of a sudden, if something goes wrong here, now you've got some interesting ramifications for that, both making sure you get out of the group and also trying to win the group and avoid potentially a matchup with Sweden in the round of 16. Then on Saturday, trying to figure out Denmark and who would that be? Denmark and China. There we go. Sorry, my apologies. Denmark, China on Saturday. One of those. This is one of those groups, not necessarily at the top of my list, but one of them where I could see both of these teams getting out, and so that makes that game really important. If China go and win this game, we're having a different conversation about how this group looks. And then on Sunday, Netherlands, Portugal, that other game in Group E. Still trying to, there are some great, some not so great matchups in the group stage, but it's kind of similar to what I was talking about with the U.S. Netherlands, you're trying to win this group. Portugal, can you find a way to stifle somebody? Can you pull off an upset and all of a sudden now you're in business, maybe being able to get out of this group? And ultimately, to me, that was the most intriguing from a matchup standpoint, too, in terms of the talent, the lack of talent discrepancy, if you will. So those are your World Cup games one more time. USA, Vietnam Friday, Denmark, China Saturday, Netherlands, Portugal Sunday. Leagues Cup, it is starting. Lionel Messi is supposedly making his Inter Miami debut Friday night against Cruz Azul. These games are all on Apple TV with MLS Season Pass, just like MLS regular season games, so you won't have to do anything else differently to watch them. So Messi, Miami, Cruz Azul, Friday. Also on Friday, Club Leon and Vancouver Whitecaps in their Leagues Cup opener. Vancouver having a fine season. Club Leon obviously having continental success. So interested in that one. And then an all MLS affair, Columbus and St. Louis on Sunday. That was probably the most interesting matchup between MLS clubs for me. as we get this tournament that nobody really knows what to expect from underway. So, simultaneously, Messi is going to be playing for Inter Miami, hypothetically, and the U.S. women's national team is going to be playing their World Cup opener. So, it will be a busy weekend. Bright and early Thursday morning, things get started in Australia and New Zealand for that World Cup. Really looking forward to it. I'll be here to cover everything from start to finish, as always. That is all for today's show, though. Thank you so much for tuning in.